This is not a criticism that is levied at any other novelist or any other work of fiction, for that matter. I've never heard criticism about other heroes and other novels. Why aren't they talking about having children? Why isn't the Count of Monte Cristo or Cyrano de Bergerac focused on having children and talking about it?
It's not that she doesn't see room for children in life, because she does. It's rather she doesn't see room for this kind of unchosen duty, as though your biological endowments dictate what choices you must make with those biological capacities.
Ayn Rand's novels dramatize a moral ideal. They depict what kind of life is worth living, what kind of character is worth attaining, and the fundamental values a person ought to seek. She directly challenges the moral ideal cherished in the West for over 2 millennia and epitomized by Christianity. Her ideal is radical, new, controversial, but for many, Rand's views are as controversial for what she doesn't say as for what she does. Some critics, even those who are broadly sympathetic with Rand's views, see a glaring omission in her depiction of the morally ideal life, namely, having children. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Institute podcast. I'm Samantha Watkins, Junior Fellow. With me is Ben Baer, Fellow and Director of Content. Hi, Ben. Thanks for joining me today.
Samantha.
So, this is a very common criticism. I've heard it, I don't know how many times. And as I mentioned, often it's coming from people who are sympathetic with Rand in other realms. They might, enjoy her aspects of capitalism or individualism, but they see some sort of a mission with parenting or with having children. A recent example is from Richard Hanania. He did a podcast with Alex Epstein earlier this year and wrote a blog where he mentioned this as something that he finds troubling or concerning about Rand's works. So I wanted to start by taking a look at some of the evidence, such as it is, that the critics bring up. And so one thing they'll mention is, in Rand's own life, she didn't have children, she didn't want children. And then in her novels, especially Atlas, we don't get a sense that it's something that's important to her heroes, idols. From what we're told, it's not something they think about or plan for. They're focused on their careers, on their work, and the goals that they've set for themselves to achieve. The more honest critics will, concede that there is a passage in Atlas Shrugged that mentions a woman who decides to be a mother, who has children and pursues it as her line of work, as a career. But often they'll still be dissatisfied and say something like it's too little, too late. Hanania in his blog, he puts it, it's an excellent passage, but it's all you get on having children out of a novel that's over 1,000 pages long.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Samantha, that this criticism often comes from people who are broadly sympathetic to Rand. I think that's true about Hanania. It's not always true. The kind of original source of this claim, the text for it, I think, is the Whittaker Chambers review of Atlas Shrugged in 1957 in the National Review. He's someone who is not broadly sympathetic with Rand. He's quite hostile to her in every respect. And yet I often hear people who've read this review, who think of themselves as sympathetic to her, still cite his claim as a criticism they want to make. And I'll just quote the passage from the review here, but I think there's certain things about it that are revealing. He says, "For in this story, as in Mark Twain's, all the knights marry the princess, though without benefit of clergy. Yet from the impromptu and surprisingly gymnastic matings of the heroine and three of the heroes, no children, it suddenly strikes you, ever result. The possibility is never entertained, and indeed the strenuously sterile world of Atlas Shrugged is scarcely a place for children. You speculate that in life, children probably irk the author and make her uneasy." I think it's revealing and important that just as he's worried about life without children, he throws that together with a life without clergy. We'll come back to that a little bit later.
Yeah, I do think it's revealing that there's something else going on behind the criticism besides what's presented in the book. Personally, I've always found the quote unquote evidence from the books to be baffling. So, coming from a person who's particularly obsessed with children, with becoming a parent, I mean, in fourth grade, I decided I'm going to have 9 children someday. It hasn't happened. But if anybody was going to pick up on some sort of anti-parenting, anti-child bias in the novels, I think it would have been me. And, even at the time that I read Atlas Shrugged, I was 17. I was a very serious Christian. Like, there were lots of things in Atlas that I found challenging and controversial and hard to process. But this idea that Rand is anti-parenting or anti-child did not strike me, did not rise to be a criticism. And I think it's because, if you look at the books, I don't and how novels are criticized in general, this is a double standard. Um, this is not a criticism that is levied at any other novelist or any other work of fiction for that matter. I don't think most people even know whether other famous novelists had children. And if they didn't, I've never heard, for example, criticism of Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters or Louisa May Alcott for not having children in their own lives. I've never heard criticism about other heroes in other novels. Why aren't they talking about having children? Why isn't the Count of Monte Cristo or Cyrano de Bergerac focused on having children and talking about it? Or, even when they acknowledge that there is a passage about children in Atlas Shrugged, but it's too little, too late, I don't hear similar criticism of other, lengthy tomes. Lord of the Rings, the 1,000+ page trilogy, and we wait till the very end of the last novel to hear some of the heroes are moving on with their lives to have children. Why so little, so late? So I think there's a double standard going on. And when you look at what's actually, in the novels, the depiction that Rand has, a very lengthy depiction of Dagny and Eddie and Francisco as children in part one of the novel. That's my favorite part of the novel. And it's one of the most beautiful aspirational depictions of childhood in all of literature. And when you look at the scene where she is describing the children and the parent, the woman who decides to become a parent, I mean, it's just amazing and beautiful what she described. And I'll read a little passage from it. So she says, "The two boys had the open, joyous, friendly confidence of kittens who do not expect to get hurt. They had an innocently natural, non-boastful sense of their own value, and as innocent a trust in any stranger's ability to recognize it. They had the eager curiosity that would venture anywhere, with the certainty that life held nothing unworthy of or closed to discovery. And they looked as if, should they encounter malevolence, they would reject it contemptuously, not as dangerous, but as stupid. They would not accept it in bruised resignation as the law of existence."
Yeah, and I've always liked that scene as well. Your point that the critics overlook the extensive passages where we get the childhood of the major heroes and heroines recounted in Atlas is a really good point. It's one I've often made, and it's especially important because Ayn Rand sees a lot of philosophical significance in what she calls the spirit of youth, the promise of the spirit of youth. She probably appreciates this more than any other philosopher, the value of the kind of genuine innocence and devotion to the potential of life's possibilities that come with youth. If anything, she thinks everybody should live in that state, young and old alike, and she thinks that there are all kinds of irrational ideals, especially from religion, that are responsible for people not being able to maintain that state through the rest of their life. The biggest of them being original sin. If you think we're all born sinners, you can't legitimately celebrate the innocence of youth. And so, for the Christian conservatives who are lamenting what Rand says or doesn't say about children, they should really look at themselves in the mirror. And what I think this really points to is that it's not really the absence of children that that's really bothering conservatives, especially since there is no such absence. It's what really bothers them is the absence of parents who are bound to their children, for whom there's a unchosen obligation to raise them, regardless of whether they want them or not. And you make this point about the double standard, the literary double standard. And I mean, one thing that it helps bring out is that the the critics making it are really not even thinking about what it means for. I mean, I suspect that they know this and they're just trying to make an excuse. But if you're talking about literature, you're talking about a form of art, and artists are necessarily selective. They try to emphasize what they think is particularly universally important to all people in life. That is, if we're talking about great literary artists. Um, Here's a simple way of thinking about this. Ayn Rand's novels also don't depict too much eating. I think there's a hamburger mentioned at one point in Atlas Shrugged, but that's about it. So are we to infer from this that she is therefore against food, to say nothing of various digestive processes? I mean, these are just not talked about at all in her fiction, so I guess she's against eating. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. That she just doesn't think that particular aspect of life is worth stressing as something that's metaphysically important for life as such. And it's actually true that having children isn't part of everyone's life. It wasn't part of hers. So she just doesn't see it as important enough to stress. There's many other things that are still true about life that or she acknowledges are real and important to certain people, but just not part of the kind of world, the image of the world that she's trying to project. What she is trying to project is the necessity of pursuing values in the face of obstacles, the prospect of their achievement. And yeah, it could still be, even though it's not mentioned in the text, that John Galt and Dagny go on to have children later on in life, along with Kay and Ragnar. That Mr. and Mrs. Rourke get together at the end of The Fountainhead. We don't know. It doesn't really matter. There's lots about their life that these stories don't tell because they're selective. Um, and one other thing I would say, apart from being expressive of an author's worldview, their view of human nature and morality, the things I was just talking about that they see as of universal importance, it's also really important that art is an expression of an author's sense of life, their personal sense of life. There's something very individualistic and idiosyncratic to an author. And Ayn Rand herself had very individualized interests, all the way from, she liked the color blue-green to skyscrapers to the fact that, yeah, she herself wasn't interested in having children. That's true of some people. Some of us, I'm one of them, just aren't interested in having children. Just like we don't have any interest in certain careers that we don't choose. And that doesn't mean that we're against other people making the choice, or even that we think it's unimportant to them. And if you ask me, that scene that you read from a moment ago, with the woman who chooses to have children in the valley in Atlas, I mean, I think that's there to make clear that even though she's not stressing a lot about this choice in life in this book, because it's really an expression of her sense of life, she wants to flag for her readers. Well, I'm not saying that this is the only thing you could be concerned with. I know that other people make this choice very legitimately, and she's one of the positive characters doing it.
Yeah. And I mean, when we look at more broadly Rand's discussion of parenting or children or education, we get that same sense that, having children can be a part of a rational, happy, selfish life, but only if the people who choose it are doing it because it actually means something to them, because it's a value to them. And then only if they do it in such a way that they're pursuing it intellectually, they're pursuing it with their minds ambitiously like you would a career. There's an interview that Rand did in the 60s with Playboy. I mean, this is at a time when most women are not working, like a majority of women are not working outside the home. Even fewer mothers are working outside the home. And they pose, a similar question to her. They ask, in your opinion, is a woman immoral who chooses to devote herself to home and family instead of a career? Rand replies, not immoral. I would say she is impractical, because a home cannot be a full-time occupation, except when her children are young. However, if she wants a family and wants to make that her career, at least for a while, it would be proper. If she approaches it as a career, That is, if she studies the subject, if she defines the rules and principles by which she wants to bring up her children, if she approaches her task in an intellectual manner. It's a very responsible task and a very important one, but only when treated as a science, not as a mere emotional indulgence.
Yeah, I should say, I think when she responds to that question by saying not immoral, I assume that what she means is not necessarily immoral, because if someone decides to stay at home to have to raise a family, but it's not because of the kinds of reasons you just talked about, not because they think it's actually going to make their life happier, but because instead they think it's a selfless duty. Well, there, I think she might raise questions about the morality of it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's important that what she's saying is that it's got to be something that makes you happy, not just because that is her ultimate standard of morality, but if you even care about doing something well, you've got to enjoy it. Um, and here she's thinking about it as a kind of career, just like any other. Lots of people don't do that. They think, well, um, suddenly I've gotten pregnant and now I need to go through with it, and nature or God or family or whatever is dictating that I must have this child. And I guess I'll just, go with the flow and follow the orders that my doctors give me. But she's pointing out that no, it's actually a heavy responsibility to raise a child, to do it well. It requires not just going with the flow and doing, what other people tell you, but it means doing some studying and thinking and learning. We're not nobody, mother or father, is born knowing how to do that. It's something you've got to study and learn in one form or another. And so it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of hours of thinking. Uh, and uh, if you don't actually want to be doing that, you're not going to be able to motivate yourself to do all that work. And then that means you're just not going to be very good at it. And you're going to have kids that resent you. And I mean, there's obviously exceptions to that, but it pays well to like what you're doing if you want to do it well. And last thing I'll note about that is that uh, the part about why it would be impractical to uh, uh, to stay at home and have children without thinking about career beyond that. And that's a significant point, that, yeah, your children are going to grow up, and then what are you going to do with yourself? If the way you've thought about it is that the whole purpose of your life is having children, and then they leave the nest. Well, what's your purpose anymore? And I mean, I think a lot of people I know who have children often, and I don't think this is the only way to do it, but they often try to think about, well, what are ways that are complementary um, to my career? What are forms of career that would be complementary to having children, so that when you're done with one stage of it, you can move on to the next. And the fact that you have to think about these kinds of things, that you have to think about what are you going to do with yourself when the child is gone. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think it's not a universal part of life that everybody would want to do this, because not everybody's always going to be able to come up with that way of balancing parenting with childhood for lots of different reasons. That is parenting with having a career for lots of different reasons.
Yeah. Now she emphasizes a lot how much thought and responsibility and choice becoming a parent requires, and it can't just be something biological that you just let happen. Um, in her lecture on living death, she makes this point. She says, "The capacity to procreate is merely a potential, which man is not obligated to actualize. The choice to have children or not is morally optional. Nature endows man with a variety of potentials, and it is his mind that must decide which capacities he chooses to exercise, according to his own hierarchy of rational goals and values."
And as I was suggesting earlier, I think this is really the view that the conservative critics in question here are the most uncomfortable with. It's not that she uh, doesn't see room for children in life, because she does. It's rather she doesn't see room for this kind of unchosen duty, the kind that you think you might have simply because you have the capacity to procreate, as though your biological endowments dictate what choices you must make with those biological capacities. And that's why I said before in that Whittaker Chambers passage that it's revealing that the same paragraph talks about how in their lives, in the lives of the characters, there's not only no children but no clergy. And clergy, of course, for him, I think he was a Catholic convert, are symbolic of the unchosen obligations that are allegedly imposed on us by some supernatural deity. And so he and others like him, I think, are particularly uncomfortable with the idea that, no, you have to choose your own goals and your own priorities in life, that purpose isn't handed to you on a silver platter by God or by nature or what have you. The rationalization that they'll give for this discomfort is, well, if you don't have this purpose or these values handed to you, if they're not imposed on you without choice, they'll think that means there's no objective morality at all, that it's deuces wild. And this is a rationalization. It would take a lot longer to discuss this, but it's ridiculous to think that if there's no God to impose morality on you, that there could be no morality. In fact, I argue the contrary, that the whole religious approach to morality is anti-morality in all kinds of ways, because when you see values as somehow imperative and obligatory, regardless of human choices, the values then become completely arbitrary. They're unrelated to your motivation, to your reasons for wanting to do things, and therefore unrelated to your life. They have no guidance to offer for the actual decisions that we make in life. And you start to see morality as the enemy of your life. And this is why morality has such a bad reputation, a kind of stale odor of, stagnation and boredom. And it's because it's associated with duty. Uh, if you want to live, in fact, there are principles that show you how to do it, based on the fact that we are living creatures who have certain kinds of needs, that we need to pursue certain values if we want to live. And of course, if we want to live, that's itself a choice we have to make. And then in addition to that, there are other personal choices that we have to make about which particular values in life to pursue, where there are real legitimate options, because certain things are equally rational, and will be chosen based on individual characteristics of different individuals. But that certainly doesn't mean that it's no hold bars, that there are no standards that govern them. Um, if you choose to have children, if you decide that you want to have children, there are definitely standards for what counts as good and bad parenting. And as we already discussed, you're only really going to be motivated to find them if you're doing it because you want to.
Yeah. No, and Rand, when she talks about parenting, she often emphasizes or education, for example, she emphasizes how the decisions matter and how um, you can't make these decisions lightly. And if you do end up like you're talking about, where it's morality versus life and things are just a duty, like that can't be good for your relationship with your children, for actually meeting their developmental needs, for taking the decisions that you need to make for their life seriously. And Rand has extremely high standards. If you read, her essays in Comprachicos or Art and Moral Treason, where she's talking about the developmental needs of children, she often has very strong words for the parents and for the educators who aren't doing right by the children that they've brought into the world, who are destructive of their minds. She treats parenting as a decision that should be made with eyes open, and should be pursued like responsibly, taken very seriously.
I think this goes back to the point I was making before about the way she stresses, like no other philosopher does, what's special and important and valuable about what she calls the spirit of youth, something that she thinks we should all hold on to, however old we get. And yeah, so if you think there's something really important about that period, then you're certainly going to look and care about what are the requirements for getting through that period, for developing out, in that period. And this is part of why she's interested not just in what it takes to be a good parent, but especially what it takes to be a good educator. She has a lot to say about philosophy of education, which you've explored elsewhere, Samantha. And one thing I would add to all of that, which she certainly stresses in many different places, is that if you care about raising a happy child, one thing you definitely need to care about is their self-esteem. and their capacity to earn self-esteem. But it's a capacity that is going to be undermined, undercut, negated if you raise children uh, under the heading of, no, you should grow up to be selfless and do your duty. In other words, the view that you have of parenthood, if you think that parents should pursue selfless duties in having children, well, who grows up to be parents but your own kids? If you're saying to your kids, yeah, I'm raising you so that you can go on and do something else that you yourself don't want to do selflessly. Well, what is the effect of that going to be on your children's self-esteem? Are you raising your children just to be selfless themselves? You don't actually want them to be happy as an end in itself? Well, what are you doing it for then? Why would you do that? It would be a sadistic thing to do to children. If you actually love children, you want them to grow up to be happy and to make the choices that make them happy, whether it involves having children or not.
So I want to turn to then, um, how you reconcile, Rand's ideas, her philosophy with being a parent. Because I think, someone who has this criticism, we're listening, they'd say, all right, fine. Maybe Rand's not anti-children. Maybe she loves children. She has high standards for parents. But still, how can you be an objectivist? How can you live a selfish life and have children? For example, Hanania brings up this kind of point in his blog where he's criticizing Rand, where he says, I think there's some fundamental tensions between having children and living in accordance with Rand's worldview. Infants are not very smart. They don't have moral principles. They have nothing to provide in exchange with their parents. And so I take his point to be that, there is no trade happening here. There's nothing that babies can give you. So why selfishly would you ever choose to have them? And, first, I think it's important to recognize that a parent-child relationship is a very unique kind of relationship, especially in the early years. You can't compare it directly with adult relationships. I mean, you as the parent decide to have the child, they have no say in that whatsoever. And you can't reason with a young child either. You can't say, "All right, you attain this character, and then I will love you." Um, and your responsibility to them, is really great. And so, it's in a distinct category of human relationships. But with all of that said, if you do want children, they do give you so much in exchange, profound, meaningful value you get out of being a parent. I want to be a parent. I'm a step parent right now. I get immense value out of being a step parent. And, there's all different kinds of things that you could mention, getting to see them experience things for the first time, see them experience things that you love and enjoy them too. There's almost nothing better than that. Watching them, master skills, accomplish things, just their raw potential. There's so much value in that if that's something that you want for your life.
And I should say I am not a parent. I don't actually want to be a parent, which is a good difference between the two of us for the sake of this conversation, because I want to say, even though I don't want to be a parent, I can totally see why a lot of people do. I don't have kids, but I have a lot of friends who do have kids, and so I can infer from that what they would get out of it. And yeah, you stress that it is a very unique kind of relationship, the one that you have with one that a parent has with their children. And nonetheless, it's important that it's a chosen relationship, that kids don't do the choosing. That's obviously true, but the parent does. And that's part of what makes it unique, but it's also what makes it similar to other things in life. So just like with friendship, you choose your friends, and part of what you choose your lovers, and part of what is valuable about those relationships, and part of what generates the commitments that they involve, is the fact that you made the choice. You didn't have to make the choice. Part of the value is that you made it, and you value your own choices. And so that's part of what then generates commitments between parents and children as well, and the value of the commitments. And you, of course, don't unlike a choice of friends, you don't get to choose your children uh, for what kind of person they are. That's something that is, at least at the present state of technology, not really up to parents. The main choice that you have with regard to who the child is who you can at least try to help them become, insofar as you educate them and insofar as you help to form their character. But of course, children have free will, and just like everybody, and so you can only affect that to a certain extent. And it's true, you can provide all the best education, all the best upbringing as you can, and still children might end up making bad choices and might end up, hating you or whatever. And that's something that you just have to be comfortable with. Uh, it's a real possibility in life, and it means that your relationship with your children will have kind of different standards than relationship with chosen friends will be. And so the way I often think about it is the nature of a parent-child relationship is kind of a cross between friendship, insofar as you are choosing to have a child and you are choosing to raise them in the way you choose your friends, but of course you can't really control it. There's another perspective which is sort of like the relationship between artists and their artistic creation. Of course, the artistic creation you have full control over. It doesn't have free will. The child does. So it's not really like either of these. That's why it's really a sui generis kind of value. But one other thing I would add, and this is again something that strikes me as true the more I see my friends with their children and the more I observe children myself, I think it's got to be true that part of the kind of metaphysical significance and metaphysically selfish value that comes from raising a child is the way that it allows you to relive the process of growing up. We all were children at once, at one point in our time in our past. And so getting to see a child grow up just like we did once is sort of the ultimate form of nostalgia, to put it in a very crude way. And evidence of this is that there are parents who abuse this fact. Like, there are parents who try to make their children live the life that they wish they had lived, and to the point where they become manipulative. And I'm certainly not endorsing that. But the fact that there's even a temptation to do that, I think, is evidence that there is some kind of value in observing a recapitulation of one's own living processes that comes with being a parent, and you get intimate knowledge of that when you are being a parent. I only get to see it from a distance since I'm not one. Um, and the fact that there's this kind of you get to observe this recapitulation, I think, is at the root of a certain kind of wisdom that I think you acquire if you are a parent. I don't think this is the only way to acquire this kind of wisdom, but it is a frequent way. I think people I know who are parents just have certain practical wisdom of dealing with people, that a lot of non-parents, I think, don't. I certainly don't have. And so that's yet another one of the selfish benefits that you get out of this sort of metaphysical value of the nostalgia, of reliving one's life, because you get to observe what makes people tick, what leads them to develop in a certain way, and that gives you sensitivity for how other people are and how they became the way they are, and how they make choices. And um, yeah, so I still don't want to have kids, but I totally get why people do, and in a slightly alternate life, I could imagine wanting to have them myself.
No, and I've certainly experienced that. I wouldn't claim to have any outsized wisdom or anything like that, but just in the little bit of step parenting that I've done over the past couple years, like, I've come to understand both stages of life that I went through better, but also understanding things from my own parents' perspective better. It's like, "Ah, man, it was hard to deal with me, wasn't it?" You get a new perspective on your life and your own childhood for sure. But I wanna turn to, this idea that, okay, but doesn't parenting require sacrifice? Maybe you want to be a parent, maybe you want children, so it's a value to you, it means something to you, but doesn't it still require you to sacrifice things? People they'll bring up, like, you have a baby, you're gonna have to sacrifice time, sleep. Maybe you have to live somewhere different than you would otherwise prefer, get a different job. There are all kinds of things. You have to go to a dance recital. Maybe you don't like dance recitals. Um, this is, coming from a very conventional view of sacrifice, I think, but it's not Rand's view. How would you explain kind of this confusion about sacrifice and parenting?
Yeah, it's sometimes a confusion and sometimes a purposeful, distortion, for the sake of, in this case, dumping on Ayn Rand and her views. But, the typical confusion here that's cashed in on is the confusion between sacrifice and investment. So think about investment just in a financial context. Some investor spends a lot of money. They give up money that they could have spent on consumption, but instead they invest it in some form of production. And sometimes people will even say, "Oh, they're sacrificing their money," but that's a huge misnomer, because if anything is selfish, a investor who invests money with the hope of making even more in the long run is the paradigm of it's a paradigm case of selfish behavior. And so it can't be that just anytime you give something up temporarily, that counts as a sacrifice, unless everything that everybody does every time, all the time, is sacrifice, in which case the concept loses its meaning. And so there's a lot in life that is investment, that is not sacrifice, you're giving it up for the sake of a greater return for yourself. And anything that's excellent in life involves investment, involves hard work. You spend energy, time, lots of thinking. In other words, it involves a cost. You have to pay a cost in order to expect a greater return. And certainly the same goes for parenting. You are investing a lot of time and energy and, emotional stress and strain, because of the aforementioned selfish values and experiences that we talked about, that you hope to get not only from the actual activity of raising children, but the relationship that you hope you will someday have with the grown child. And of course, that is only hopefully, because again, children have free will, and you can't plan another person's life, and people will make choices. Your children will make choices that might end up diverging from your values, and you might not be able to maintain the relationship. But that's nothing unique to parenting as an investment. There's always risk that you assume with any kind of investment. You might spend a lot of money to invest in some business, and then the business fails, and you don't end up making the money that you hoped for. But the fact that you uh, didn't end up getting the expected return doesn't make it a sacrifice, because the intent was to have that return. The intent was to have that selfish benefit. And when we talk about what makes something selfish or not, we're talking about the person's purpose. What are they aiming for? What are they trying to get? And so, yeah, it is probably true, unfortunately, that there are parents who sacrifice. Uh, and this may be part of why people associate parenting with sacrifice. But I guess our point is, it doesn't have to be that way. Like, that if you're really only having children as a sacrifice, it's certainly a possibility. It is not a desirable possibility. It's a recipe for your misery, and in many cases, the misery of your children.
Right. Yeah, I like to put it as, like, I really care about children being happy, and because of that, I only want the people who actually wanna have children to have children. I do not wanna pressure somebody who would otherwise not wanna have children into doing it out of some sense of duty, because that's just a recipe for disaster for everyone. I mean, sometimes maybe you have a change of heart, but there certainly are families and parents who do experience everything they do for their kids as a sacrifice because they didn't really go into it, thoughtfully because they actually wanted it. The last kind of, criticism or, conflict that I wanna bring up, there's a lot of talk in the culture right now about the quote unquote "fertility crisis," the idea that, fertility rates have been on the decline, for a long time. If you look at the chart since the 1800s, it started declining. We had a jump in the baby boom. Um, But people are very concerned about this, and so they see a tension, if they know about Rand, between, her emphasis that having children should be a choice, should be optional, and, the fate of society as a whole. Like, if we want society to survive, shouldn't we, encourage people to have children? Shouldn't it be elevated as a choice? And, for Rand, she doesn't think that individuals should be a means to some end, whether it's society's end or God's or, genetic legacy, whatever, the case may be. An individual's an end in himself. Like, his life is sacred. And so she rejects the idea that there's some sort of duty to have children. And, um, the conventional kind of pro-family types, the people who, cast themselves as pro-family. In my view, I think these people are anti-child, they're anti-family, they're anti-human because they want to sacrifice individual lives at the altar of society or God or genetic legacy. They're projecting, a vision of society where we're slaves to some sort of duty. And that's not a society that I want to live in or that I want to see continue.
Yeah, so you mentioned the fertility, situation that many of these people worry about, and, like, there is an interesting question or problem here, because, yeah, population is projected to decline. And the reason that there's an interesting problem here is because, like, there are lots of ways, in fact, in which older people benefit from the presence of younger people, whether it's their children or not. So, like, I'm not having children, but I am really glad that my friends are for lots of reasons, and not just because it's good for them, but because, like, I see ways in which younger people, generally speaking, add to the value of my life. You don't have to be very old before you start noticing, oh, these people are doing everything from bagging my groceries to it's especially a strange experience when much younger people start to be your doctor. But like it's all over the place. So it's unquestionable that to use the Whitney Houston cliche that children are the future, and if you're a rational human being, you care about the future of your life, and in at least a kind of extended projected sense of the life of the species. You want to see the species go on. You're not going to be around to see it, but it'd be really nice to hope that it's going on. And if you want concretization of this, watch the movie Children of Men, where there's some kind of ecological disaster that causes everyone to be infertile, and nobody's all the children are growing up, and there's no children replacing them, and it's very depressing. Um, it is, and there's just pleasure in seeing young people around you. But I think what what's legitimate here is there is a certain kind of problem about productiveness. That is, what's going to happen when they're I mean, I don't think we're really facing a children of men situation. But yeah, there's a declining population in Western industrialized countries, and there is a question about how increasingly um, aging population is going to be supported in all the relevant ways by younger people when there are just fewer of the younger people. And I'll add to this though that a lot of the same people you hear complaining about the fertility decline and population dearth, et cetera, are also some of the same ones who are complaining about how AI is going to take over and take all the jobs. Well, okay, maybe these two problems cancel each other out, because uh, we'll have more technology to do more of the work that otherwise, would have been done, by lower skilled people, and that will just leave more interesting and challenging work for the smaller number of people who are there to do it for us. And I think, in principle, this should not be a existential crisis. This is just yet another, problem of survival to deal with. That is a problem that we deal with thinking and intelligence and technology.
Well, thank you, Ben, for joining me today to discuss this. Some other resources that those of you who are listening or watching today might want to look at. There's a lecture by Greg Salmieri on reproduction and the objectivist ethics. And then Ben has an article called The Fountainhead and the Spirit of Youth that you might also want to check out. But otherwise, thank you for listening today. Please subscribe, comment, share on the relevant platforms. And if you have any comments or questions, you can send them to newideal@aynrand.org.